It's Halloween, and there's no better story that is beloved around the world and made famous for Halloween than the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Made famous by the novelist Washington Irving, his legend of Sleepy Hollow involved a deceased Hessian whose head was taken off by a Patriot cannon. Or rather, his novel involves the ghost of this beheaded Hessian chasing a very frightened Ichabod Crane. Now, in Irving's fantasy story, his character, Ichabod Crane, is victim to this ghost, who in actuality would have been Brom Bones, who was a sort of rival of Ichabod's, who was trying to chase him out of town. The novel that he writes is incredibly fun and fantastical, but it does have its roots in history. This time, I'm covering that history, the truth that spurred the legend. Irving himself hints at the Headless Horseman being a real ghost story, told by the Dutch inhabitants of that area. It was a site in New York that was fought over during the American Revolution, a place near Sleepy Hollow. So here, I will explore the origins of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Irving wrote the story around 1820, 38 years after the war was won, and only 8 years after the War of 1812. Irving got his inspiration from his own home territory of New York, a place founded by Dutch settlers and named Tarrytown in the 1600s. It was thus named because the settlers would gather in that area on their travels and tarry in that location. After the American Revolution, these locals supposedly told tales of a headless soldier, a Hessian, who lost his life in battle and was buried nearby. Irving's Headless Horseman is therefore likely inspired by this historical account of the American Revolution. This is the story of the Headless Hessian Soldier. Hessians were German troops from the states of Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau. They were called upon to aid in Britain's fight against the American colonists, conscripted by their royalty to serve the British as auxiliaries to their army. These men were made to serve whether they wanted to or not. One particular Hessian was reportedly decapitated by a cannonball during the Battle of White Plains in 1776. The Battle of White Plains took place on October 28, 1776. It was a significant engagement for the entire war. This battle was part of the larger New York and New Jersey campaign, which followed the heart-wrenching capture of New York City by the British, and Americans were forced to retreat northward. General George Washington would spend the entirety of the war wishing he had never lost New York. Washington chose White Plains as a spot for defense, located about 25 miles north of New York City. He had hoped it would be a defensible position where he could regroup and potentially halt the British advance. The battle was a particularly gruesome one for the war, for both the British and Patriot forces had significant casualties. A famed Scottish Patriot officer named Hugh Mercer was sadly bayoneted to death. This battle technically ended as a victory for the British in terms of tactics, but the American forces did manage to avoid a decisive defeat, with the British and Hessians losing more lives. It was during this skirmish that the infamous incident occurred. Major General William Heath wrote a memoir in 1798. He was a Patriot officer and recalled his times in the war. He was present at the Battle of White Plains. Major Heath stated that the British artillery was advancing, but that, unknown to them, were some 12 American pounders. Upon the discharge of which, they made off with their field pieces as fast as their horses could draw them. A shot from the American cannon at this place took off the head of a Hessian artilleryman. Major General Heath continued by observing they also left one of the artillery horses dead on the field. Henceforth, there was indeed a real decapitated Hessian soldier in New York. Horses were used to, of course, haul artillery, often with riders atop them. And from Heath's witness testimony, it was a bloody engagement. Another Patriot soldier named Anthony Maxwell, who was in Colonel Malcolm's regiment, he is said to have witnessed this Hessian's death firsthand too, and apparently talked about it for years after the war. As the story goes, the corpse of the beheaded Hessian was buried soon after his death at the Old Dutch Church in Sleepy Hollow, near the small village of Tarrytown. It was believed that the Hessian would arise at night in search of his head, and anyone who was ill-fated enough to come across his apparition was condemned to death. And now you know the history of the headless Hessian of Sleepy Hollow. Next, I'm going to tell the rather fun, rather thrilling, fictional story Washington Irving wrote. Tomorrow's Halloween, so what better way to celebrate than by delving into history, and then fantasy, and one of the first American short stories centered around the 18th century.